Yes, so in our last discussion, we talked about IP addresses and port numbers and URLs, and we were about to discuss the concept of DNS, and this is what we want to look at it today. And basically, the domain name system. What is it? We are saying that a domain name system is a system that resolves or that converts the domain names into IP addresses. All right, it converts the domain names into IP addresses. And now, what is this domain name? Earlier on, when we introduced the concept of an IP address, we said that for each computer to be able to communicate or send a message on the internet, it needs to have a unique identification, and that's an IP address. An IP address is nothing but a number which is assigned to that particular computer to be able to communicate and be identified. And so, if computers need to communicate using those IP addresses, then it means that if you want to access any server or you want to access any online computer so that you can be able to send a data to it, you need to know the IP address. You need to know that number explicitly. And because the numbers are very difficult to remember, people had to invent another way of labeling those computers, and they come up with the domain names so that any server computer on the internet can have a unique name which it can be identified with, but that name can only be used by humans, by the users. But for the computers themselves to be able to send data to each other, they still need to know that IP address of that computer. For example, your laptop, which is a client computer, to be able to send a request to a YouTube server, which is hosting the YouTube videos, your computer or your laptop needs to know the IP address of that uh, YouTube server. And since it needs to know the IP address, then we need to know a way in which we can convert that domain name into an IP address. And the way we do that is the way we do that conversion is by using the domain name system. So it's a system on the internet. It's a server somewhere on the internet that does that conversion, so that when you go to your browser and type youtube.com, then that system has first to translate and get the IP address of that YouTube server, and then now your computer can now be able to communicate or establish a communication with the YouTube server. So that's what you're saying. Users normally use domain names in the browsers, but first, before your computer can communicate, then that domain name needs to be converted into an IP address. So the browser will first check its local storage, which is the local cache, to see if it already has the IP address of that domain. Because normally when you visit so many websites, what your browser does is that it stores the IP address of those websites that you have visited temporarily on its local storage, which is the cache. And so that when you come back to visit that website for the second time, then the browser is going to check first on its local cache to see if it already has the IP address. If it doesn't, then the browser is going to send a request to the domain name server. So this domain name server is the one now that will resolve or that will convert the IP address, and then it will send back the IP address to your computer. Then now the browser, once it gets the IP address, it will now send a request to the server or to that website, right? So that's how a communication happens. And if you look at this table, um, it has a list basically of the domain names or the host names and their corresponding IP addresses, right? So that's what the domain name server has. It has all the records of all the domain names and their corresponding IP addresses, so that when any browser makes a request that they need to access this, then the domain name will convert, will know this domain name belongs to this IP address. Alright. And when you look at this second diagram here, you're going to see that this is a typical representation of how a communication happens between your local computer or your browser and the web server that is hosting the website. So this web server where the website is deployed, it has an IP address and it also has a domain name, and this domain name must be recorded in the DNS server, because the DNS server is like a global database of all the domain names and their corresponding IP addresses. So today when you go and buy a domain name, your domain name has to be recorded on the DNS server. So that the first thing the browser will do is that if you come and type the domain name in this your browser, then the browser will first check in its local cache to see if it already has the IP address of that website, if you have already visited that website before. If it doesn't, then the browser will first send a request to the DNS server to get the IP address of that website. So the DNS server is going to respond by sending back the IP address. Then once your browser or once your computer gets the IP address, then now it is going to send a request to the web server using now the IP address. And now the web server is going to respond by sending back the web page that can now be displayed in the browser itself. Alright. Then now we've said a domain name. A domain name looks something like this. If you look in this diagram, you can see a domain names like a www.example.com or .ke or whatever. So now let's in detail discuss the structure of the domain names, so that when you build your web app or when you build your website, obviously you're going to deploy it somewhere and you're going to have a domain name for it. So therefore you need to understand the structure of a domain name, because you will be required as a developer to somehow generate or come up with a suitable domain name for your website or your web application. So now, what is the structure of a domain name? So we are saying a domain name is a human readable address that is used to identify computers. And when we say computers in this case, we mean computers that are servers, computers that are hosting some content like websites, server computers, and computers that are hosting some online services, right, on the internet. So the domain name, it maps an IP address through the domain name system. Alright, so we could have an example, like an example of a domain name could be like what you're seeing here, www.codearchive.ac.ke. Now if you take this domain name and break it down, you're going to see that it has parts, and each part has a meaning. Each part has a meaning. So we are saying that the domain name is made up of levels or parts which are separated by dots. Okay, so we have the top level domain, which is the rightmost part. Here you look at it, the rightmost part is what we are calling in the top level domain, and this typically ends with .edu, .org, .com, .net, .gov, .ke, .uk, and all that. So the top level domain indicates, right, it indicates the type of that website. What is that website about? Is it an organization? Is it a commercial entity? Is it a social network? Is it a government organization? Is it an education website? It also indicates the country in which, it might indicate the country in which the website is hosted. Like for example, KE standing for Kenya, UK is standing for United Kingdom. So it might end with a country code, alright, to indicate that this website belongs to this particular country. or it is hosted in this particular country. So it indicates the service that is provided by that website. Then we have the second level domain, which identifies the organization name. All right. For example, if you look at this name, Code Archive, it means that the organization that is owning this website is Code Archive, or it can be www.University of Nairobi. So you know that the entity or the business that is owning this website is this. All right. Then we have the subdomain. Let me pause a bit. Sava, Yambe, alright, so then we have the subdomain, which categorizes sections of websites. For example, if you look at this our domain name, let me undo again there. So when you look at this sample of our domain name, you look at it, the last part of it here is what we're calling the subdomain. So the subdomain now again identifies the categories of website. So the website, is it a World Wide Web kind of website? Is it a blog post website, or what kind of website is it? All right. Then we have the root domain. The root domain is a combination of second level domain and the top level domain. So that means that from here to here is what we are calling in the root domain. All right. So why is this structure is important to you as a developer or as a software engineer is because when you develop your website or an application, you're going to deploy it, and you're going to have to come up with a creative domain name, a domain name that represents your organization, and a domain name that represents what you do. All right. So you will need to come up with a clear root domain, which is a combination of second level domain and the top level domain. All right. That way it makes your website easier to access, because if you come up with a very clear and easy to remember domain name, then people will find it easily, uh, again in relation to what you do. Right. So that's what we mean by a domain name. It's nothing but a system which converts the domain names to an IP addresses and allows communication to happen. Until this point, I will pause in case you have a question to ask before we can go to module 2, which is web programming. Any question?